Give it a couple of moments. Yes, that's right. And then this first Monday talk presented by the Public Diplomacy Council of America in partnership with the Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy at USC's Annenberg School. I'm Nick Cull, and it's my great pleasure to be host today, where our guest is George Stevens, Jr., who is one of the last great figures from USIA's golden age, that amazing time when Ed Murrow sat in the director's office at USIA, and his immediate successors, I think, showed what could be done engaging foreign audiences through all kinds of mechanisms. And George is the person who ran motion pictures for USIA during that amazing period. The immediate reason for George joining us is the publication of his memoir, My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington. And we'll be talking about that book. So welcome, George.
Pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you.
The book is more than just the autobiography of a man with an insightful central chapter dealing with his time in public diplomacy. It's also the biography of an industry, the movie industry, and it's one of the great surprises reading the book is the extent to which George's family, of course, his famous father, George Stevens, and his grandparents were part of the birth of Hollywood. So in this one book, we go from Hollywood as a barnstorming, improvised, new diversion somewhere on the West Coast through to the age of streaming and all the digital things we have today inside one cover. And I think that an important part of George's life has been his work after USIA to realize the potential of movies as a more than just a money-making enterprise, as a form of art. And those of you who've served overseas as American public diplomats know the significance of Hollywood. Whether we like it or not, Hollywood is the world's window on America. And there are many points in this book where the image of the United States, both positive and negative, is front and center. So there's a lot for us to get our teeth into, but I wanted to start out, George, by talking to you a little bit about the process of writing the book. And as you put your life down on paper, was there something that really surprised you? What did you learn writing all this down?
That's interesting, Nick, because I do cover for really well over a century in the book, and I fortunately have a good memory, and I've kept. My father was a great keeper of things. My mother sort of was our informal family archivist, and and in terms of writing the book, what you indicate is true. There are things I remembered, but then you write about them decades later, and you get a different insight into what you remembered. And I would just give one example that, well, first I would say that I mentioned my mother keeping these records of our family, papers, clippings, photographs, just two huge boxes that were such a resource, because in my day, as a young person, we didn't dwell much, or in our family at least, on the past. And for me to have all these records, mainly from San Francisco newspapers, because my great-grandmother, his name was Georgia Woodthorpe, was born after the Civil War in San Francisco. And at age 6, she met this Shakespearean actor who asked her parents if she could join his company in San Francisco as a child actor. And Georgia went on to become a star on the stage, traveling around the country as well as in San Francisco. And she is the youngest Ophelia to Edwin Booth's Hamlet, the greatest of American Shakespeareans. And I have a clipping, a big story about her and Booth. And so I had those wonderful recollections. And she is the mother of my father's mother, Georgie Cooper. And on my mother's side, her mother was named Alice Howell, who was in vaudeville in New York. And her husband was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And she had to go to a warmer climate. And her husband had been singing in a quartet with a fellow named Max Sennett, who left New York to go to Hollywood and start the Max Sennett Studios. So my grandmother, Alice Howell was her name, or that's another story. She went to Los Angeles, and Max Sennett gave her a job as an extra. And she was very good at what she did. And he hired a new fellow from the Carno touring group. He thought his name was Chiffin. He sent a telegram, can you ask Chiffin to be in touch with me? And it was, of course, Charlie Chaplin. And so my grandmother, Alice, was in the first 5 movies that Charlie Chaplin directed, and went on to become a silent film star of her own pictures, a comedian. So I have all of those records. But in writing the book, one incident that I remembered that it took a different dimension. I went in 1951 to the Academy Awards with my father. He'd come back from 3 years at war, and he'd made a movie called A Place in the Sun with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor. And I was sitting next to my father in the Pantages Theater, I believe it was, and Joseph L. Mankiewicz, a prominent director who had won the Oscar the year before, came out to present the award for Best Director. And he announced the films and the nominees. John Huston for The African Queen, William Wyler for Detective Story, Vincent Minnelli for An American in Paris, Elia Kazan for A Streetcar Named Desire, and George Stevens for A Place in the Sun. You might note the sort of higher caliber of nominations in that year. And I wouldn't be telling the story other than A Place in the Sun did win the Oscar. And we were returning home. He was driving the car. My grandmother and mother were in the back seat, and the Oscar was on the seat between us. And I think I was about 18, and he, don't know what led him to it, but it was deep in his nature. He said to me, he said, we'll have a better idea what kind of a film this is in about 25 years.
Right.
Now, this was before Cinematex, it was before streaming, it was before home video. But he'd grown up in the theater with his parents, his actor parents, and read O'Neill and had a sense that art is what lasts. Mm-hmm. And so I remember that. And of course, it occurred to me that in 1951, he did not know that he was speaking to the future founder of the American Film Institute, for which The Test of Time and the movies that last were very much at its core.
So when did you first become aware of the international power of movies?
We were not that conscious of the international power, although there was a cinema on La Cienega Boulevard that would show some classics. But my first real sense of it was in 1957 when Dad and I were preparing the Diary of Anne Frank.
Mm-hmm.
He was on the jury of the Cannes Film Festival. And I write about that occasion in the book of coming onto that international scene. And it was the year of Truffaut's 400 Blows, Ingrid Bergman's, I forget which of his pictures, but that's when I began to get a sense of the international aspect. And then when I went to USIA to work with Ed Murrow, and I headed delegations to film festivals, and a man named Henri Langlois, the head of the Cinémathèque Française, a kind of disheveled, sort of but exuberant man, captured me on the Croisette and started telling me about the loss of American film classics, that they were not being preserved. So I began to feel that influence, around that time.
But you see film as a part of America's power in the world, but also something that through which America can not only put forward a better face, but also be better. And one of the things that comes through the book is your commitment to anti-racism.
Yes.
And could you talk about how did that begin? Because a lot of people seem to have been through the same kinds of upbringing that you had without feeling the burden of telling stories that will make the world a better place. How did that come to you to use the medium?
I think my parents were very empathetic individuals, and my father's work was so frequently directed to the outsider, to the underdog, whether it's Alice Adams in 1935, the young woman who's trying to make her way from a lower class person in a Midwestern city, or even Gunga Din, which was one of my favorite films, and of course the character played by Sam Jaffe of the regimental beastie, the water boy who wanted to be a soldier, and the humanity with which that character is treated, and Shane was a bit of an outsider, and Jet Rink and Giant, you can kind of go through the movie. And certainly Anne Frank, a film that I worked with my father on. So I think that kind of was part of me. And when I came to USIA, one of the primary priorities really was we were facing this both beginning of racial unrest and progress at home, and the newsreels abroad were filled with police dogs and attacking African Americans, et cetera. And so I kind of found some of our most successful films. One day I'd read an article in the Sunday magazine of the New York Times about the 9 people who went into Little Rock High School with National Guard support against jeering crowds. And I called on I'd enlisted a lot of new filmmakers, and Charles Guggenheim was one. And we proceeded to make what we call, I loved the opportunity. It was not the title of the magazine article, but 9 from Little Rock. Kind of sounded like Bad Day at Black Rock.
Yes.
and that was, and we won the Academy Award for that film. And we made a film of The March, about the 1963 March on Washington, that was, I would say, one of the very best films we made during that period. So it kind of came naturally to me to be interested in that, and we had a purpose at USIA of showing some dimension to the racial question in the United States.
How was it working for Ed Murrow? Because he was somebody who was so much a part of everybody's life during the 40s and 50s, and he's a big character in the book. You name your son Michael Murrow Stevens, but so I know he had a big impact on you. But how was it working for him?
It was exciting working for him, and he was without making any much effort along the line, he was a wonderful mentor. And a Foreign Service officer told me that Ed had the veteran Foreign Service personnel playing over their heads. You know, he inspired them. And I remember he used to say, I'd happily staff a network with the men and women I have here, less women than men, I might know. And he, yeah, I'll tell you just a story about Ed, which I think sometimes a story is more revealing than description. And it came toward the end of my time working with him, but on November 22nd of 1963, I'd been invited to the Chilean embassy. The ambassador had become a friend for a luncheon. And it was a beautiful fall day. And I remember as we were, it was not a huge embassy, and we were sort of in an entryway, and Senator Hubert Humphrey was there, and Ralph Dungan, who was a key Kennedy advisor. And I just remember Dungan saying to Humphrey, the president, it looks like it's going to be Barry Goldwater, and the president really looks forward to running against Goldwater, you know. And then we're at lunch, and I saw Humphrey be taken out of the room, and he comes back and tells us what's happened in Dallas, and it was a small luncheon, maybe 14 people. And then he comes back and he said he's gone, you know, and burst into tears. So, you know, I had just turned 30, and actually a little later than that, 32. And, you know, it was very, you know, shocking and you know, unintelligible in a way. But I started to think, what's my job? And so I asked to see Murrow the next day, and he had been away having had his one lung removed, and he was not in his Savile Row suit. He was in a green sweater. And I went upstairs. My office was on the 3rd floor. His was on the 4th at 1776 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I came in, and Ed never sat behind his desk. He always came over and sat on the sofa across from you. And he sat down and he handed me a letter. And we had made a picture called The 5 Cities of June, another of the most successful, which involved Kennedy's trip to Berlin. And Ed handed me this letter, and it said, "Dear Ed, we're so happy you're back from the hospital. We're counting on you. The 5 Cities of June is, I think, the best documentary, government documentary I've ever seen. You know, looking forward to seeing you sign John Kennedy." You know, to be holding that letter 10 days after it was written, and in that circumstance was so moving. And I handed the letter back to Ed, and he put up his hand and he said, "You made the film you keep the letter. And then I spoke to Ed about what I had come up with as my thought. And I said, I'd like to make USIA's first feature-length film that we have camera crews with color film in 7 foreign capitals, filming the reaction of the people in those countries. We will film the 4 days of the funeral in 35mm color and make a film in which we interweave the Kennedy presidency with an emphasis on the sort of policy ideas, civil rights, peace, et cetera, the outer space. And it's going to cost $250,000, which was a startling number in 1963. And Ed was silent for a moment, and then he stood up, and then he said, first, he said, make a 10-minute film about Lyndon Johnson. I mean, it was, you know, the young person with his heart on his sleeve, and Ed, the wise and experienced one. And he said, and then you can make your film about Kennedy. And we did that. And but it was just a sense of how Ed Murrow ran that agency, that he did have a very good sense, not surprisingly, of the policy objectives, and in a way of leadership that brought people to their best.
And my impression was, from talking to the filmmakers themselves, that they had tremendous creative freedom and didn't feel micromanaged by him or by you, that you allowed them to tell the story as they saw. Was that your impression too, that you had freedom was an important part of it?
That, in terms of the filmmakers, that is true. I came from I had been directing television in Los Angeles, Peter Gunn and Alfred Hitchcock, and working with my father. And I had a sense of the difference between when a network or a studio was trying to influence the work in an unhelpful way. And I was not going to be that person. But I also told these filmmakers that this is not your opportunity for the purpose is not your artistic pleasure. You may get some of that, but the films must speak to the policy idea that governs it. And so we had a balance there. And our problem was more, we had, as some of you know, at USIA, we had area directors for the various regions. And they would look at the scripts, they would come to the screenings. And in number one, there were 7 of them, plus deputies of a couple of Murrow and all, and you ran the risk of having 9 opinions, when you're trying to really make. And one of my mantras was respecting the audience, not laying it out too much for them, but leaving something for them to do. And so that was my struggle or my challenge.
Holding the area directors at bay.
Absolutely. And, and these were bright, well-educated, experienced people, but very often with a tendency to underestimate the audience. And in the 9 from Little Rock, we began with the scene of these children being taken into the school with the National Guard and hateful jeering crowds. And, there was objection right away to that. And I argued that showing that scene, while it shows us to disadvantage, gives our film some credibility, and also lets the audience understood what these children faced as we go on to tell this story about these 9 students, and most of whom had very good careers through high school, and on. So it was always a bit of a wrestling match, and Ed, having spent time, defending his work before executives at CBS and advertisers, kind of inside, was inclined to come to my rescue when needed.
So, but how did things change for you when the next director came in? Because you also had to work with Carl Rowan, and then later on Leonard Marks. What were their styles like, and how did you experience their leadership?
Well, I really enjoyed Carl. He was a good spirit. I remember we, just parenthetically, we had a meeting in Los Angeles, and that night I took him to La Scala, a restaurant on Santa Monica Boulevard, the old La Scala, as we called it. And in the front small room in red booths, there was, Kirk Douglas and his wife were over here, and others. And for dessert, we sat down with Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood, and it was Warren Beatty and Natalie Wood. And by the end of the evening, Carl was singing a duet with Natalie Wood from West Side Story. But when the march became controversial, which was not long after Carl came to USIA, there were some people, a person named Clark Mollenhoff, who was a very a kind of a journalist who was on USIA's advisory committee, and a very opinionated, let's say, fellow. And he'd taken an objection to the film and was talking to Congress people about it. And there's a whole chapter on the book. I will not go into detail, but there was concern about the film. And Carl's solution was to do a 60-second on-camera 60-second introduction to the film, in which he did everything we were trying to low key, telling him that the government made the film, and it's and all of the thing of the kind of very low key narration, and letting you feel and see the white people and black people working together, so that's a longer answer. That it became more difficult under Rowan, and even more difficult under Leonard Marks.
I think my favorite, there are wonderful stories in the book. Your encounter with Stan Laurel, watching for the rushes of a routine he'd written being performed by Oliver Hardy, is just so precious. But there's one story from your USIA years that I wonder if you could share. When you went to Moscow and found a wire under the carpet.
Oh, this was my second trip to Moscow. The first was incidentally quite interesting. As head of the delegation in 1963, Stanley Kramer was going to be head of the jury. I'm working slowly to the carpet. And I spoke with him, and I was going to be head of the delegation. And I thought it'd be a good idea to screen some of Stanley's films. No films were really being shown, very few in Moscow, American films. And Stanley, had made The Defiant Ones, Judgment at Nuremberg, so many good films. And at Terry Catherman, who was an officer at the embassy, he and I worked up this list by wire. And then I got a message the State Department had rejected the showing of these films. They thought they would show America to disadvantage. And I had become acquainted with Averell Harriman. And I asked Averell, I said, well, what do you do? And he said, let me think about it. And he called me at 7 o'clock the next morning. And I later asked him, I said, why 7 o'clock? And he said, I like to get people thinking about my problems rather than their own. And this was,
That's right.
My problem had become his problem. And he said, Tommy Thompson's your problem, referring to Llewellyn Thompson, who was at that time distinguished ambassador and serving on the NSC for Kennedy. And he says, you have a meeting with Tommy Thompson at 4 o'clock on Thursday. And, so all of a sudden I'm 6 months out of Hollywood. And I got to go to the 7th floor, and I sat down with Ambassador Thompson, and I told him, my view. I said that showing these films to Russian filmmakers, they're going to see Stanley Kramer able to talk about justice and civil rights, in The Defiant Ones, and described how these films and that the Soviet filmmakers will respect and envy them. And Thompson agreed, and he said, all right. He said, as long as they're only shown to the film community there. And so we took the films. And there was Madame Furtsova was the Minister of Culture, and she had a deputy named Baskakov, who was really a hardline, tall, difficult man. And we're doing great. The filmmakers love Kramer's films and all. And then I heard that on Sunday night in the Kremlin Palace of Congresses, which was the centerpiece of the festival, with 6,000 or 7,000 audience capacity, The Defiant Ones had been scheduled. And so a friend, Ilya Lopert, who worked for United Artists and spoke 7 languages, had become kind of my ally. He was on our delegation. And we went to see Baskakov, and Baskakov taught me that possession is 100% of it. And he was going to show it, which of course would be very, compromise my promise to Ambassador Thompson. And one thing I did enjoy, Ilya Lopert swore at Baskakov in 4 languages, which I found illuminating, but they were going to show the film, nothing we could do about it. So we went back to my suite, and you know how difficult it was in those days to make phone calls out of Moscow. Mm-hmm. And we called Sidney Poitier in London, and he was making a picture there for United Artists. And Lopert said, we can get you Saturday off if you can fly in for the Sunday morning screening of The Defiant Ones in the Kremlin Palace of Congresses. And feeling that, in my case, that would offset the public aspect of it. And Sidney said he'd do it, and he flew in. But while we were about to go to the airport to pick up Sidney, Baskakov called us and said, no, we've changed it. We're going to show The Defiant Ones at the sports arena 20 miles outside of town at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. So we had to go to the airport and tell Sidney that his mission to Moscow was, and that we had Kramer and Lopert and Sidney and I had a very nice dinner at a restaurant called Aragvi, which was sort of where the dance people, culture people went to. We called it Sardi's very east. There was a restaurant in Sardi's that lasted only a few years called Sardi's East. This was Sardi's very east. Next morning, we went in a van, got picked up at 9. We got to the sports arena, and there was a serpentine line, I was told later, of 9,000 people waiting to see the Defiant Ones. Not knowing that Sidney Poitier was coming, just the appetite to see an American film. And we spoke before the film, and it unspooled. And we were sitting in the sports arena slightly above the audience, you know, kind of just 10 feet or so. And so we could watch the audience watching this film, and they were so compelled by it. And then when it was over, they just streamed over to this box and cheering Sidney. And actually Susan Strasberg, who was on the delegation, was with us, and she was sitting with dark sunglasses. And Sidney was taking the bow, and he kind of looked around, and she's an actress, and he put his hand down to have her stand up, and the glasses fell off, and her face was just covered with tears, and Sidney embraced her. You know, so the Russians were getting a sort of a different than expected experience. And Henry Tanner wrote about it in the New York Times, a glowing piece about how in this and other ways, our delegation was a triumph, and how young Russians were. So I was home free with Tommy Thompson. And then the other story, the next time I went to Moscow on my honeymoon, which was another, I'd already planned to head the delegation in 1965. And when Liz and I decided to get married, we went. And Rex Harrison was there for My Fair Lady, and we had the screening of My Fair Lady. And after, I took Rex and his wife Rachel Roberts and Jack Lemmon and his wife Felicia, and the 6 of us. I had a bottle of vodka and caviar and all of that. And it was very nice. And they were, I don't think it blots the memory to say that Rex and Rachel and Jack, until he stopped, were serious drinkers. And anyway, I came back down, and I'm in my hotel suite that they provide with a piano, and I had enough vodka and I'd been briefed before going, and by the security people came to my office and said, you know, everything that goes on in your room is recorded, and you have to, you know, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, you know. And I think I became somewhat irritated, and I started looking for the bug. And I went all through the piano, and Liz had gone to sleep, and the kitchen, and found nothing. And so I went in the bedroom, and I saw these wires coming out from under the carpet near the bed. And I pulled them out, in this serious wiring going on there. So I went in the kitchen and got a knife, and I severed the wire, you know, and then I went back and I wiped the fingerprints off the knife and put it back. And I kind of overslept. The next morning I hear pounding on the door, and it's the woman, Annie, my guide, who was very bossy. And she said, Mr. Stevens, you're supposed to be downstairs at 8:30 to go to Cinematographers Union. I said, oh, okay. And I kind of headed off to get dressed. And she said, Mr. Stevens, did you sleep all right last night? And I said, yes. She said, oh, I was concerned because the chandelier in the floor below fell, and I thought you might have been disturbed. Anyway, that's my story.
I think that at that moment, this is a good moment to open it up to other council members to have questions for you or comments. Sherry.
Thank you so much. Let me just. All right. Well, I will do it audibly. Thank you so much. What a wonderful treasure trove of reminiscences and images. Would you be kind enough to say to share a few of your favorite films and the reasons why. I teach cultural diplomacy at American University and have often shown my students Years of Lightning, Days of Drums, and think it's just one of the most, it touches that universal quality in all of us, that our mortality in such a profound way. So it is one of my super favorite films, and particularly to share. Would you just give us a couple of examples of favorite films of yours that you like to share with colleagues, and why?
Are you speaking of films from the USIA?
It could be maybe your favorite from USIA and your favorite from Hollywood in general.
Well, the film John F. Kennedy, Years of Lightning, Day of Drums, is the film that Ed Murrow approved after I would make a film about Lyndon Johnson. And that was very kind of satisfying that film worked the way it did, and I believe it was generally accepted. It was very affirmative film for showing overseas, and it was a film that led to the Congress, as most of you know, that USIA work is not allowed to be shown in the United States for the good reason that you do not want an administration to turn the funds dedicated to USIA into political propaganda at home. But there was bipartisan feeling that you might not have today, that this film should be seen by the American public. So they passed a resolution, and it was distributed. And actually, it was chosen by the National Board of Review as one of the 10 best movies of 1964, or 5 for the year. And gosh, there's so many films. I'm sort of partial, just you could go so many ways with that, but I'd love people overseas to see my father's film Giant, which was made in 1956 with Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, and James Dean, for which he won his second Oscar. That when you think, I mean, first of all, it's tremendously compelling and moving film about America and American, all aspects of our nature. But it also, made in 1956, it had a woman as the central figure, the driving force in the film. And it had a racial component that was almost non-existent in those days in films, which is the treatment of the Hispanic people in Vic Benedict, the head of the Riata Ranch, who marries Leslie, Elizabeth Taylor, in Virginia and brings her to Texas. Just has tremendous, it's a moving thread of the story, and you think it's a blockbuster, 3 hours and 20 minutes, and that it's going to end with a chariot race. The last scene in Giant, which was a tremendous success, is Vic Benedict and Leslie Benedict, grandparents, with 2 children in a playpen, a blonde girl and a boy with brown eyes and dark complexion. And it's this touching scene where Vic Benedict realizes and accepts, without saying it so much verbally, that the future of the Benedict family is going to be Jordan Benedict IV, who's Hispanic. And, that for audiences to have this tremendous experience of enjoying Giant, we screened a restoration of it at the Turner Classic Film Festival on the big screen last month. and so people do get some insights into a kind of hope for tolerance in American society.
Could I go now to Ambassador Morris Greta? You had a question.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you very much, George. This has just been such a wonderful presentation. But when you talked about some of the wonderful films of the past, including A Place in the Sun, one of my all-time favorite films, and it just seems like that the films that we had in sort of that golden age of Hollywood were so wonderful and such great representations of the United States. And I just feel like maybe the films and of course other aspects of sort of social media today lack some of that wonderful quality. And I'm just wondering what you feel about the sort of the public diplomacy value of current films and current other forms of popular entertainment. Are we still representing America in the same really great way that we did in the past?
Well, to be fair, along with these kind of classic films I'm describing from that kind of golden age era, there were a lot of problematical films that were, less than desirable. But to the core of your question, no, it's a very different picture today. And I mean, this is a larger topic I come to in response to your question about film. But at the time when USIA was dissolved and elements of its work were folded back into the State Department, I was preoccupied with other things, and I thought, well, maybe CNN is now there, and so it's a different time, and maybe. But as time progresses, for a long time, I felt it really first when we had this difficulty of when the Muslim world became more, let's just say, on stage more directly, that we didn't have a USIA to both be having our ears to the ground and kind of directing policy and information to kind of project an understanding of that. And so many other things that we're facing now that the president does not have the tool of an agency with a modernized from what USIA was, but with film and television and social media, and to be projecting what we like to think of our view of America, and that what the police dogs attacking Blacks in the 60s, we are projecting things with gun violence, for example, hate speech, that we would like, and how do we present our position on the Ukraine to gather support? It occurs to me that maybe the time for USIA was not past.
Mm-hmm.
Michael.
First, I want to just preface my remarks by saying that Ambassador Morris will remember that for the APEC conference in Manila, we presented Giant to a wide range of Filipino audiences. It was not without difficulty because we had to guard the film to make sure it wasn't copied. But Giant was before a large group of people in Manila when Ambassador Morris and I were there. But my question, you pointed to the issue of the difference in approach by the area directors when you had to face some ideas that they had, and a more open approach, a more critical approach. And, you know, today, from people who serve in VOA, for example, prefer the USAGM approach because it prevents political interference in some of the things they might broadcast. USAGM, just so you know, is the VOA successor to the agency which runs VOA. So many people didn't like the idea that USIA had so much influence over what VOA did, and they prefer a more an autonomous organization to run it. That would seem to suggest that the film service, if there were a film service, would have been better under an independent agency rather than being influenced by the role of the area directors. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's interesting, very interesting question. I think part of the VOA, and there was a tension with VOA, as you all know, at different times. I think that has to do with, in part, that they are news people who are trained to project the news as it is, and their USIA under Murrow was that there was an obligation to show ourselves warts and all, but to frame policy in a certain way. I think that, well, it's hypothetical, but you know, the films, we were making films that did carry what they used to call freight, and it was a question of how much freight. So I really don't have a good answer to that. I just would leave it as a very good question.
Could I saw that Mike was here and Mike Schneider was here and unmuted. So Mike, did you have a question? I know you
Sure.
Screened some of George's films in the field back in the Kennedy years. So, but your question.
Well, I comment on what George Stevens said. I was involved in a lot of the meetings that George had with the area policy officers and directors about the content, and I don't recall it being so much about policy as it was the perspective of the field from the different regional points of view, and so I wonder if that was George's recollection. Was it really policy versus telling it like it is, or was it different takes on what would be relevant and what would be convincing in the different points, different regions of the world?
That's a very good point, and I think yes, a good deal of it was our people won't understand this, or and there's also I think you could recruit some or several people who might make the point that I was a bit arrogant and too certain of my own views, but there definitely was. Will they understand this? And I was in this kind of frame of mind that I screened Years of Lightning, Day of Drums. I went on a trip to, I think it was 7 African countries, must have been 1965, I guess, in the Congo. And we took a mobile unit out into a village, and I watched it, you know, with the group. And I remember they gathered on both sides of the screen. And I was interested how they stayed with the film. And that at a certain moment in that Years of Lightning, Day of Drums, when President Kennedy goes to Dallas, there's the footage of him drive the limousine driving through the streets and a close-up of the school book depository. And I'll never forget that the audience erupted with this sound when they saw the school book depository. I mean, that, and I would make that case, and others would make an opposite case equally skillfully, that, that the audience sometimes is more in tune with what's going on than we want to give them credit for.
So I wanted to bring in Greg Tomlin, who wrote this wonderful book on Murrow's time at USIA. Greg, you have a comment or a question just as we're moving to the end here?
Yes, I do have two quick questions. The first is, I was wondering for your reflections on your very first productions at USIA, Invitation to Pakistan and to India, if there's anything you wanted to comment on that. And then the second piece is, you were new to Washington, almost 30 years old, and you're not a political appointee, but you're a senior executive official. Outside of the agency, who did you engage with? You mentioned Averil Harriman, you mentioned the Chilean embassy. Who was in your circle that helped sort of shape and inform your approach to getting senior leaders in the State Department and USIA to support your artistic efforts? Thank you.
Well, Arthur Schlesinger, Richard Goodwin, Ted Sorensen, whose brother was the deputy director, Tom Sorensen at USIA, Hubert Humphrey. Gosh, Washington was a different place then. The senators lived in town with their families. They were at school board meetings. They were, with Republicans and at sports events for their kids, and it was they were. I had wonderful, Robert Kennedy, I had wonderful associations that, not so much helped me at USIA, but just kind of being plugged into the community.
Could I ask another question, Nick?
Sure. We have to bring it to an end pretty soon, but if it's a quick one, Michael.
Yeah, very quick. Do you recall 5 Cities in June?
Very well.
Did you think that the element on Kennedy and Berlin was, it certainly dramatized the impact, but when we got it in Calcutta, we were worried that the film was a little too heavy, actually, for the Indian audience that we had in mind, the young audience. And I wonder if you had any second thoughts, maybe in retrospect, about the footage of Kennedy in Berlin, that huge, massive crowd, the kind of a charismatic relation that he had with the crowd. It's a little scary in some respects if one thinks about Berlin in a different context.
Yeah, I guess that's the drama of that, and then the charisma of this man, with even a touch of humor, as a leader. I might have been more concerned about our one scene in Vietnam where we were showing our advisors helping the village, but I respect your view that could have been true to an Indian audience.
One thing, George, just to round things off, and thank you so much, by the way, for being with us today, for giving us your time. I know you've got an incredibly hectic schedule. I see you're appearing at the Academy Museum, I think Friday, and you did an interview with Michael Beschloss and you've been all over. So thank you for fitting us into your schedule. When I was working in the Kennedy archive, I found a note that Jackie Kennedy sent to Murrow. And in it, she said that after the president died, she and his father didn't know what to do. So they got together and watched all of the old USIA films over and over and over again. Now, I was, I knew that the world used those films as a way of feeling close to the president, but to think that his father and his widow used the films in the same way, I was devastated by that. Just an amazing document. I showed it to Bruce Hershenson, who was overwhelmed to know that was the case. So these were powerful films, even for the family of President Kennedy. But thank you for writing the book. Thank you for your time.
Which I must say, as we authors do, I quote that letter in the book.
We should, I should call now on Greta Morris to wrap things up.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for arranging this wonderful program, and to George Stevens, truly just one of the most fascinating discussions I have heard in such a long time, and really very inspiring. So thank you so much for taking time in your schedule to be with us today. This has been just wonderful. I am the co-chair of the program committee for the Public Diplomacy Council of America, and I just wanted to announce our next program, which will actually be the second Monday in July instead of the first Monday, because the first Monday is July 4th. So our program will be on Monday, July the 11th, and the title of the program is Engaging Religious Actors in Public Diplomacy Toward Peace, Development, and Human Rights. And we're going to have three really wonderful speakers, all experts on the subject. Dr. Peter Mandeville, who is Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University. He was formerly an advisor in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs under Barack Obama. The second speaker is James Patton, who is the president and CEO of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, which has worked with the State Department on some of its programs in the past. And the third speaker is Palwasha Kakar. She is the interim director of Religion and Inclusive Studies at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And her areas of expertise include Islam and gender, particularly in Afghanistan. She is an Afghan American and has spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan as well as in the United States. So I welcome all of you to attend that program on July 11th at 12 noon. So thank you again very much to everyone who joined us today. And I guess special thanks again to George and to Nick. So thank you.
May I have one final word?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, I just want to thank, if I may refer to them as the two Michaels. It's very touching to hear your professional views and the fact that you were involved in showing these films. So I especially appreciate your comments.
We were very lucky to have you, George. They mark a high point in government-sponsored video that has never been reached before or after.
Yes.
I thank you.
So true. Thank you again, everyone.